too. These things always make me nervous. 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to be in Los Angeles. But the problem with the conference was, first of all, in Pasadena, that had the fires nearby. And so there was a pressure on accommodation. And the second thing is, of course, so many people were a bit afraid about traveling to the States at the moment, because we think that what they are doing is they're running your details through AI. And so many things will pop up. I know that I would have been having a holiday in El Salvador. And Mary was having nightmares about me going, but it was all put online. But for people in our region, it meant 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was a co-host on a system that I'd never used before called Hoover. And I was so nervous in that present. I didn't sleep the first night beforehand, just so anxious about what happens if I can't make it work. And there's no one here in Sydney I can communicate with to help me. But it worked perfectly, but it was so anxiety rising. And it was a Trump thing, Trump.
He's listening, don't. I'm not saying nothing because I'm going.
Yeah. Well, I think my sound system is on, isn't it? Yes. Yes. Well, we'll get going. This is the fourth in this historical series. You might recall the first one was on the Council of Nicaea, because it was the 1700th anniversary, and it has to do with what we believe in the relationship between Jesus as the Son and God the Father. It also had something to do with the way in which the Christian faith moved from being on the margins and a minority, a persecuted minority, within the Roman Empire, to Constantine being, in a way, a Christian emperor. And he had put forward a policy of tolerance and removed legal discriminations against the Christian faith. And that began the way in which the Christian faith became much more a part of the heart of many societies in Europe. He did not make the Christian faith the official religion of the empire. He often gets blamed for that these days, but he didn't do it. It was someone else 50, 60 years later. The second one was on her story, which is a story of from gladiators to midwives. Gladiator to call the midwife because of the role that women had played within the life of the church. And her story has often not been told and is not so well known in the life of the church, and yet there were some very significant women along the way. The third one was last time was on COVID, and it had to do with the way in which the Christian faith in the past had dealt with pandemics and plagues, sometimes being really inspirational like they were in the very first few centuries, and sometimes getting it drastically wrong like they did in the Black Death. All the good priests really died, and all the bad priests thrived and made money. So that was the third. The one I'm going to look at today I've called it Allah. Allah is the Arabic word for God, and it was used before the English word God was used, which is an interesting thing. But of course, it allows us to consider the relationship between the Christian faith and Islam. Now, what I'd like to do next year is another series, and they will probably do another aspect of women in the life of the church. I also thought it would be quite useful to take a look at the way in which the Christian faith has responded to war, because in many ways our churches today are still struggling from the legacies of the First and Second World Wars. Dramatic things happened, especially in the wake of the First World War. The third thing is, because of the issues around the world today, I thought another one would be on the way in which the Christian faith responded to totalitarianism and or authoritarianism, autocracy, sometimes doing it quite well and sometimes being co-opted. And the fourth one at this stage is a mystery. I haven't decided. Well, I want to start off then. What I want to cover today is, first of all, just say something about why we need to look at the relationship between the Christian faith and Islam today. The second thing I want to do is give you just a few insights into some basic Islamic beliefs alongside the crossovers, in a sense, with the Christian faith. The third part, I'll do some history where we will note who Muhammad was and how how the Islamic faith spread, leading into the Crusades. Now, we're not going to go into every crusade because there were 8 of them, but that then gives rise to the loss of Constantinople. And if anyone's been to Istanbul and been to the Hagia Sophia, have you been to that? It was the greatest of Christian churches. And I must admit, when I went inside it for the first time, I just said to myself, I want it back. And I remember saying this to an early church historian friend of mine down in Melbourne. We were at a conference together, and he agreed, and we committed to not taking the Eucharist again until we retook Hagia Sophia. But we weren't able to get our horses out of Victoria because there was equine flu, so it's still outside Christian hands. And then what I want to do is take a look at how Martin Luther responded to the Ottoman incursion, where the Ottomans made it right to the gates of Vienna. And then I want to jump to Australia, to the late 20th, early 21st century, but noting, this may surprise you, Islam made its presence felt in Australia before the Christian faith did. Did you know that? Well, it did.
North Australia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Quite a while before the Christian faith did. Well, the Christian faith, Islam and Judaism are part of what are called Abrahamic faiths. In various ways, they look back to Abraham, although, of course, in Islam, it's Ibrahim, but all 3 faiths look back to Abraham, and they have a lot of crossover in terms of basic storylines, which I'll come to in just a moment. They differ from, say, Hinduism and Buddhism. One of the distinguishing marks is not only that they look back to Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, they also are monotheistic, the belief in one God. And that is one of the distinguishing marks of an Abrahamic faith. So sometimes here today you will hear that there's been an Abrahamic conference, and that might mean that there are participants who have come from those 3 faiths. Why this theme? Oh, the Canadians have arrived back. Gary Balmer, whose photograph is on the screen there, was a sociologist of religion based in Melbourne. And he examined the way in which all the different faiths you now find in contemporary Australia. He wrote a book called Many Religions, All Australian. And what he was wanting to argue is that we are now in a new normal. When many of us were younger, either in Australia or New Zealand, you could have expected if someone was going to be religious, they would have been Christian or perhaps, to a lesser extent, Jewish. But that world has now passed because of the effect of immigration and birth rates and what have you. We live in a very multi-faith kind of world, alongside the many nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And he wanted to say, this is the new normal. Alongside him, the minister of the Baptist Church in Collins Street, Melbourne, Simon Carey Holt, is a former chef, but he became a Baptist minister. He wrote a book about dishes and the way in which different cultures and faiths have different kind of foods, which is a very intriguing way to get to know another faith. But he took into account who is your neighbour and was wanting to highlight how neighbourhoods have changed. If you live in Castle Hill today, 5.1% of the population in Castle Hill is Muslim. If you live in Bella Vista, 17% is Hindu. There are more Hindus than Anglicans in Bella Vista, and although we have a substantial presence in Bella Vista, it's modest compared to other faiths. So our neighbourhoods have changed. And of course, the Christian faith is called to love one's neighbour as oneself. So what does that mean for the life of the Christian faith? Gary Balmer worked it through to say, the new normal is such that it begs the question, how are we to live faithfully? How are we to live in accordance with our own faith in a world of many faiths? And that world of many faiths is now your next door neighbour and not overseas. So that is the new normal that we are wrestling with. Any talk about mission for local congregations needs to take this into consideration and to be very realistic. And in the background to that, there is the line from 1 Peter, we are called to give an account of the hope that is within us to the one who inquires. So that's why I think that this is an exceptionally important kind of story today. It's not just an exercise in history, it is something for the present. Oh, I won't go to that. Yeah, but he put them in the wrong order. I must have put them in the wrong order, I should say. How many of you may have had an interfaith encounter with someone who is Muslim? An interfaith encounter with someone who is Muslim.
Meaning talking about your faith.
Yes. Did you feel that you knew much about Islam? Did you feel that they might have known a little bit more about the Christian faith than you knew about Islam? I think that is par for the course. Muslims know more about us than we know about them, generally speaking. Well, I think we need to do our homework because of that. Well, of course, the foundational figure for Islam is Muhammad. I think there's a streaming series on Prime on Muhammad at the moment, if you're interested. He lived around 570 to 632. According to Islam, Muhammad is the last in a line of prophets. He's not a divine being, he's a prophet, and he's the last in the line. And he was inspired to preach and conform to monotheistic teachings. There is one God. In that line of prophets, he is like a fulfillment after characters like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and including Jesus. Except in Islam, Jesus' name is Isa, I-S-A, Isa. Muhammad was born in Mecca. He was the son of an aristocrat, but he was poor. His name means praiseworthy. Muhammad means praiseworthy. His father died 6 months before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. So he was an orphan and brought up by extended members of his family. And in particular, he was raised in the care of his grandfather and a paternal uncle. At the age of 25, he impressed an older businesswoman called Khadija. She was 40, and he was in charge of one of her caravans, and she was so impressed with him, she proposed, and he accepted. Now, I have to say that Muhammad went through, he had 13 marriages, but he was faithful to Khadija because, of course, she was that bit older. So most of the other marriages came a bit later, but he did have multiple marriages at the same time. In later years, he would, on occasion, devote himself to prayer, and he wouldn't go to a church. He went inside a cave, and he prayed in this particular cave on regular occasions. And when he was around about the age of 40, that's the year 610, he's said to have been visited by the angel Gabriel and received the first of his revelations. He would receive revelations from Gabriel over the next 23 years, the balance of his life. Now, poor old Muhammad couldn't read. Gabriel kept on saying, "Read what I've written in front of you." And Muhammad was struggling, so Gabriel choked him a couple of times. But eventually what happened is Muhammad memorized the revelations. And that is important because the word Quran means a recitation. It means recitation. And you might note that when the Quran is read out in a service of worship or at some kind of public gathering which is opened by Muslims, it's almost kind of sung in a particular kind of way. We don't read our Bible in a kind of sung-like way, although you might like to try it tomorrow, but it's a very different way of reciting the Quran. And it goes back to the fact that it was memorized, and it was memorized in Arabic, which means that although you can go off to Coles, and bookshop. Or any kind of bookshop, you can go and buy an English translation of the Quran, but strictly speaking, it should be read, and it is always recited in worship in Arabic. And it's 14 chapters long, and it's not as long as the New Testament, which means that some Muslims can recite it from beginning to end. And if you can do that, you are what is called an Hafiz. Well, back to Muhammad, he had these revelations, and he then began going around Mecca proclaiming that God is one and that we were called to submit to God. The word Islam means submission. So you submit to God, that's what it means. His followers were initially from the lower classes, and they were persecuted for a while by others in Mecca who were polytheists. Polytheists are people who have many gods or many spirits, and he was a monotheist, one God. And so to escape that persecution, some of his followers went to Abyssinia, where they set up a Muslim presence there, and others went to Medina. And that's why Medina is one of the holy cities of Islam. Now, when you read the Quran, part of it reflects the days in Mecca, and other parts reflect the time in Medina. And the more militant side of the Quran, and we need to be aware that there's a militant side to the Christian and Hebrew Bibles as well, the more militant side of the Quran comes from the Medina period because there was some warfare between Mecca and Medina. By the time Muhammad died in 632, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula had converted to Islam. The primary source for our understanding of these revelations is, of course, the Quran, and I've said how it came into being in the 14 chapters. And then there are verses, they're called surah. But that's not the only source for Islamic understanding. They also have what's called the hadith. And the hadith has more to do with accounts of the life and practices of Muhammad. It doesn't have the same kind of status as the Quran, and it's not read out in a Muslim service, but it's another authority, shall we say, and it's of incredible importance in the life of Islam. And a lot of the stories they have to do with Jesus and Mary are in the hadith, although there's a significant presence in the Quran as well. Now, if you try to read the Quran as you read the Bible, be prepared for a headache, because it doesn't have a kind of a flowing literary and historical narrative in quite the same way that the Bible does. I mean, it doesn't have like the Gospels have an account of Jesus' life from birth in Matthew and Luke through to his death. Or you can read Genesis and you get a sequence from Adam to Abraham right through to Joseph. The Quran is more like a collection of oracles, and it can be difficult to get that kind of connected sense that we have in our Bible. There are 5 pillars of just one or two other things about Islam. There are 5 pillars of wisdom. These are ritual obligations that were evolved, and a good Muslim who was seeking to conform their life to the way of Muhammad would observe these. The first is the declaration of the Islamic faith, which is called the Shahada. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That is the core confessional statement. The second part is prayer, and Muslims are called to pray 5 times a day. So one of the things which has often struck Christian observers of Islam is the life of prayer and their dedication and discipline to it. Of course, not everyone will do this, but many do it. The third is a practice of, and I should say, you would notice that when they pray, they bend over in a more prostrate kind of way. Any doctors in the house? The fourth thing is that they are committed to, the third thing is almsgiving and charity to the poor, and that is based on the idea that everything belongs to God. So in terms of their faith, that's how they understand things. They are committed to fasting, especially during the time of Ramadan. And Ramadan is one of the great festivals of the Islamic faith. The other one is the Eid. And Ramadan is a time of fasting from sunrise to sunset. And then you will often, it's a time of reflection. It's a bit like Lent. But then it closes with a kind of community meal. And that's when you have the nights at Lakemba, and you can go and eat your camel burger, and as Pamela has done, I know. It's also a time where you might invite guests, and these become what are called iftar meals. And the fifth thing is that if you're able to, you should go on pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca. So there are 5 pillars of Islam. There are 2 major festivals, Ramadan and Eid. Eid is a bit more like Christmas. It ends Ramadan, but it's a time of gift-giving and celebration. One of the words, of course, that we have become very much aware of in recent years is the word jihad. The word jihad is actually to be found percolating its way through the Quran, and it doesn't necessarily mean warfare. Strictly speaking, the word means exertion, striving, struggling. And for many Muslims, they do commit themselves to jihad, but what it means is a personal struggle with those things which they believe are contrary to the purposes of God within their own life. It does have an expanded meaning where it can refer to the defense of Islam. And that is, in a sense, how that talk of terrorism has co-opted the idea of jihad. But for most Muslims, that is not what the word jihad means at all. Okay?
There's a New South Wales minister whose first name is Jihad, isn't it?
Yes. That doesn't mean he's going on some kind of bombing craze at all. It really reflects a life of striving. Al-Injil is the word for gospel. The Quran refers to the Al-Injil, the gospel of Jesus. It regards Jews and Christians as people of the book alongside them. And the Quran refers to 4 holy books. One is the Quran itself. It also refers to the gospel of Jesus, Psalms, and the Torah. So it weaves all of those three Abrahamic faiths together. But when it talks about the gospel of Jesus, it does not mean our gospels. And it doesn't mean our New Testament. It has its own understanding of what the gospel should be, which is basically Jesus is a prophet of the one God and is pointing towards monotheism. So it's a different way of thinking about the gospel, but it is a term that they are familiar with. There are two different types of Islam too, Sunni and Shia. The great majority of Muslims are Sunni. Iran, Iraq, Bahrain are Shia. Hamas is Sunni. Hezbollah is Shia. And the difference between the two is it goes right back to who should succeed Muhammad. Should it be someone who was related to him, or should it be a more like Uniting Church kind of consensus decision-making process? The Sunnis went for the consensus way, the Shias went the other way. There are other differences, but that's the origins of it all. The Quran and Christian belief. I think it's important to have some idea of one or two other things before we look at some of the history. The first is that there are some shared stories, but with rival tellings. So there are 27 stories in the Quran which have the same kind of characters and sometimes a similar kind of outline than what we find in the Bible. There are quite a number of prophets mentioned, and some of the names that will crop up are Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, Lot, Noah, Moses, Joseph, Jonah, Cain and Abel, Solomon, King David, Job, Elijah, Elisha, to which we can also add Mary, the mother of Jesus, Jesus as Isa, and John the Baptist. So there are points of commonality, at least in names, and some kind of story outline across our faiths. Mary is mentioned more times in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. She's mentioned 70 times. She is the mother of Jesus. She has a virgin birth, but there is no Nazareth, no Bethlehem, no Herod, no wise men, no shepherds in the field. She gives birth to Jesus under a date palm. So that's an alternative Christmas story for you. You might like to try something different on December the 25th this year. Jesus is the most mentioned person in the Quran. There are about 93 verses which refer to him not as the son of David or the son of God, but the son of Mary. That is how he is often referred to. He's looked upon as a prophet and a messenger. He is not regarded as divine. They do not believe that he died on the cross. The Quran believes that Jesus was lifted up into heaven. It's a bit like Ezekiel, and so did not die on the cross, so there's no resurrection. But they do expect Jesus to come back at the end of time. And so what you get with Islam is that they believe there is one God, Muhammad is his messenger, Jesus is a precursor of Muhammad, and this was interesting for me once when I gave a lecture on the Christian faith to a body of Muslims at a college. They asked me, what did I make of John the Baptist's disciples coming to Jesus saying, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect another? You can see how that takes on a fresh leg, so to speak, when it's in an Islamic context. They do not believe in the Trinity. And so if you were to be in an interfaith encounter and you were asked then to say something about your Christian faith, it's odds on, pretty quickly, they would ask, what do you think about the Trinity? Because they regard that as a form of polytheism, 3 persons. Okay? So those are just some fairly basic differences. Now let me just check for a moment. Any comments or questions in that kind of brief overview that I have given?
Our neighbours are Pakistani background, and Shahim, the lady's father, comes around a lot, and we speak with him. And he's been to the Hajj,
Yes.
I think twice,
Yes.
because his mother was, but he said, I came back washed clean.
Yes. You have to wear white.
Yes, he
Yes.
really,
Yes.
really spoke, he did speak about that, so
Yes.
it was important.
He would have had to have gone into a lottery to be able to go to that. And it's becoming more and more complicated these days with more extreme heat. There are quite a lot of fatalities now at the Hajj because of excessive heat.
I went to a conference some years ago, on Ephesus, to a place called Sanliofa in Turkey. And one of the things that they had at Sanliofa was, they claimed, was the birthplace of Abraham. It was a cave.
Yes. And if you go to Ephesus, they will show you the birthplace of Mary. So, I mean, these are Quranic stories backed up by the Hadith. But that's one of the reasons why Muslims know more about the Christian faith than you probably know about Islam, because they have some of our characters.
Clive, in Glenhaven, where I live, they're trying to build a mosque.
Yes.
And during the long discussions that have been going on for 5 years, they were the branch of Muslims that are there, whether they're Shia or Sunnis. I've got a feeling that they're Sunnis. There were discussion about the Shias. So we'll have to go and use the Shia mosque, or we don't talk to them.
That's right. It would be like asking the Protestants to go and have a service of worship in a Catholic cathedral.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the analogy.
Is there conflict between the two societies within Islam likely to get worse, or
It has got worse. It has got worse. It gets worse because of the power of Iran these days, and you can see the influence. It creates a lot of mayhem, for instance, within Lebanon, where there are both Sunni and Shia, but they cannot come together. And that's partly because of external forces at work upon them. So it's very much alive. Islam spread very rapidly after Muhammad's death, and that had to do with the rise of the Arab peoples and their military expertise. It did so in cities and regions that once had a very strong Christian presence. And it moved both east and west and south. It was referred to as the Islamic conquest, and in just a few years they took over the entire Persian Empire and 2/3 of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Within a very short span of time, Damascus, which had been a Christian city, fell in 635. Jerusalem fell in 638. Alexandria, which was one of the great Christian centres, fell in 641, all very quickly. And what you find is not just moving eastwards, you find that it moves across North Africa, so that Egypt, what we would today call Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, all of those countries become Muslim fairly quickly, and then they cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and some of you will have been to Spain. And no doubt you have been to places like Granada and other Spanish cities which had a very, very strong Islamic presence. Cordova, and this very fine architecture which reflects the Islamic period. They made their way up to southern France. They crossed the Pyrenees, but were defeated by Charles Martel in 732. Otherwise, they would have spread further up into France, what we would call France today. So it spread very, very quickly and took over many sites that had formerly been Christian. One of the first Christian responses to the rise of Islam was by a monastic figure. He became a monastic figure. He was a bureaucrat to start off with, named John of Damascus. Remember I said Damascus had been a very significant Christian city. Well, John of Damascus was still able to thrive as a Christian in Damascus because although there were military campaigns moving across North Africa into Spain and beyond, very quickly the spread of Islam eastwards led to a relatively tolerant age. They had a particular custom whereby rights were given to Jews and Christians because they were people of the book. They gave certain rights, but they also meant they were limited rights. So John of Damascus was able to remain in Damascus for quite some time, and he wrote an account of the heresy of the Ishmaelites. Quite often Muslims were, because they looked back to the line of Abraham via Ishmael rather than Jacob. So they were Ishmaelites, and John of Damascus wrote contrary to them. But he was able to have quite engaging conversations with Muslim scholars. But that came to an end. During the 9th and 10th, the 11th century, it was clear that Western, what we would regard as Western Europe, seemed to Muslims to be pretty uncivilized because they actually had a golden age. And in due course, many of the ideas which came from classical Greek ended up coming back into Europe through Arabic and Muslim hands. They also had grand architecture and what have you. So it was not just a religion, it was a whole cultural and political system. But eventually it leads to the Crusades. The Crusades lasted from 1095 to 1291. Now we sometimes wonder when some of our crises like those in Ukraine, which have been going for 3 or 4 years, how long will they last? When will they finish? I remember as a child, the Vietnam War seemed to go on forever. Crusade lasted for 200 years. And there were 8 separate crusades. They were a series of religiously motivated military campaigns, and they were initiated by Western European Christians from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries. Their primary goal was to reclaim the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim control. Sites associated with the ministry of Jesus had become popular pilgrimage destinations. So if you've been to Jerusalem and been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, anyone done that? That owes its origins to Helena, the mother of Constantine from our first series. Well, there were a whole number of pilgrim sites that people from the Christian West liked to visit. But of course that had become much more difficult now that they were under Muslim control. The Crusades began in 1095 when Pope Urban II called the first crusade at the Council of Clermont in France. There had been an earlier plan under a previous pope, but it never eventuated. Pope Urban was responding to a request for military support from the Byzantine Emperor. The Byzantine Emperor is based in Constantinople, Istanbul. And at this stage, it is one of the major Christian cities. And so the emperor of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople asked Pope Urban to launch a crusade. And guess what? There was enthusiastic support. I think Pope Urban had hoped that he would just get people of a noble disposition who would join. But that's not what happened. People from all classes volunteered to go. And they did so for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes it was seen as a form of religious, the quest for salvation. And Pope Urban promised an indulgence or two which would release them from their sins. Sometimes it was following through on feudal obligations, so that if your lord had determined to go, off you come, Alistair, you're on with me. Say goodbye. Sometimes it was for economic reasons. Why not do a little bit of looting along the way? So a whole variety of reasons why people would have gone on crusade. And there might be up to 100,000 in the army. They were large armies. The Crusaders took their name from the sign of the cross which the militants sewed on their garments. They came to be known as the Cruce Signati, those signed with the cross. And the recruiting campaign, you might remember in the First World War posters, you have Lord Kitchener saying, "Your country needs you." This time it was, "Alistair, take up your cross." And so that line was used as the campaign motto, taking up the cross. Pope Urban, as I said, sought to restrict enlistment to trained warriors, but popular enthusiasm proved uncontrollable. Now, they went by land initially, so it meant going through to Constantinople, through Asia Minor and down. And that created a few problems because Eastern and Western Christians then began to have the occasional conflict along the way, especially when you have an army of such size going through your territory and probably taking some of your food and your crops and what have you. It doesn't make for good relationships. So there was a bit of argy-bargy along the way, I think. The First Crusade culminated in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The First Crusade was able to exploit certain weaknesses within Islam at that time because there were internal succession rivalries and strife among some of the primary Muslim kings or sultans. And they were able to exploit that. But shortly after the First Crusade, all of those things were resolved, and then we began to get the succession of much bloodshed, often very violent, sieges, often a lot of illness, and the Christians were able to set up initially 4 Crusader states. Right there. You see, they kept alongside the coast. Up the top is Edessa, which is in today's kind of Asia Minor, touching into Syria. Then there's one below it, I can't quite read it. It's Antioch. Then Tripoli, which is now in northern Lebanon. And then the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which really goes down, right down to the Sinai Peninsula. And at its heyday, the Christians were able to have these 4 Crusader states. But of course, they were never, ever able to hold on to them for the whole time. Now, there were, as I said, 8 times of 8 significant crusades. A crusade could last several years. And they could take on a different flavour. Sometimes there might be more kings and princes in one crusade over and against another. Sometimes it would be more popular, so the makeup of the people going. There were occasions when wives went. Eleanor of Aquitaine accompanied her husband on crusade. I don't think it would have been a very pleasant experience. Francis of Assisi in 1219 had become rather tired of all this fighting, and so he made his way to Egypt, and he went to meet the Sultan of Egypt at that time, Al-Kamil. And he was there on the battlefield, but quite clearly different from the other soldiers, and he was taken by some of the Muslim soldiers to the Sultan. Francis tried to convert the Sultan to the Christian faith. They had a very good conversation, so it said, but the Sultan retained his Islamic faith, but was deeply impressed by the poverty of Francis, who refused to accept any gifts from the Sultan, so he was impressed. And he had Francis escorted back to the Christian troops, and Francis, of course, then makes his way back to Assisi. But in return, Francis was greatly impressed by the Muslims. He was greatly impressed by their prayer life. And he introduced some of that impact into his understanding for the Franciscan order. So a little bit of a cross-bearing there, or cross-influences. The most substantial, the greatest of the Islamic leaders was Saladin. Have you heard of him before? He was the principal guy in the Third Crusade, so that's coming up towards the last quarter of the 12th century. He was the leader who commanded the greatest respect and was the most formidable opponent across all of the Crusades. He was a Kurd. He was born into Crete, and of course Crete has been in the news over the last years because it's in Iraq, I should say. He was the founder of the Abbasid dynasty. He was the first sultan of both Egypt and Syria. He was a pious Muslim. He prayed often. He liked to hear the Quran recited. He was a supporter of Sufi mysticism. Have you ever seen Sufi mystics and the whirling dervishes? They just spin around and around and around in a kind of mystical, I was going to say daze. He was a patron of the madrasas. A madrasa is a teaching school, and he was a great patron of madrasas where Orthodox teaching was taught, and he was deeply committed to jihad. For him, jihad initially meant just that personal struggle within. He was incredibly devout. But of course, in the context of the Crusades, it also means in defense of Islam. And so he was the most formidable military campaigner that the Christian Crusaders faced. He was intent on recovering all of these Crusader states. He didn't get them all because he focused primarily. He wanted to recover Jerusalem, which at that time was in Crusader hands. And what was so striking was that he did not want there, in the wake of the siege that had been conducted, he did not want any further bloodshed. And so he put out peace terms to that effect, but they were rejected by the Christians within Jerusalem. Well, his forces eventually took Jerusalem, but they did allow many ordinary people to leave Jerusalem on the basis that they should pay a very small amount. He didn't go himself looting in Jerusalem, and in fact, when he died a little bit later, there was not enough money to pay for his own funeral. In terms of how his Western contemporaries saw him, and subsequently, they have always regarded him as the virtuous non-Christian. That's the title that was given to him, the virtuous non-Christian. And today in the Islamic world, Saladin is still highly regarded, and people have built statues of him, and in the late 19th century, I think it was a French German, an emperor anyway, who paid for something around his burial site. So he's got a very highly regarded reputation in both Christian and Islamic circles, although he was a very formidable opponent and a practitioner of jihad, I think in the fullest sense of the word, in both senses of it. Well, we in our Christian West may not know too much about the Crusades today. Are you very familiar with much about the Crusades?
A little bit.
Just a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, they used, I've been to some parts of that area.
Yes.
And they built forts.
Yes,
They
yes,
built towns.
yes.
And
Very significant presence for 2 centuries.
Very significant
Yes.
presence.
Yes. The reason I ask that is that in the Muslim world in the 20th and 21st centuries, they remember the Crusades in a way that we don't. And sometimes they will say, you complain about jihad, but for us, your jihad was the Crusades. You can see that? So that's some background. What then happened in the wake of the Crusades and leading into Martin Luther was in 1492, which is also the year that Columbus set out for America, that marks the Reconquista. That is the recovery of the Iberian Peninsula for the Christian faith. The Moors were driven out. And so that's why, although there is that architectural legacy of Islam in parts of Spain, Spain is now, of course, a Catholic country. The Moors were driven out in 1492 with the fall of Granada. But before that, 40 years beforehand, Constantinople fell. And that was in 1453. Constantinople had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It had been the new capital set up by Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Its fall came at the end of a 55-day siege led by the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmet II. Mehmet would make Constantinople the new Ottoman capital. So the Ottomans, we now know of as the Turks in more modern times, but they set up the Ottoman Empire. Its fall was a watershed moment in the late Middle Ages. It marked the end of the Roman Empire in the east. The power of the Ottoman cannons to breach the walls of the city, which had withstood sieges for 800 years, what the Ottomans did is they built huge guns which were able to penetrate the walls of the Constantinople. And the irony is that the guy who devised these cannons was a Christian from the Balkans. The city had previously been weakened a great deal, and it wasn't as strong as it had been, partly because it had been subject to other attacks, quite apart from the Ottomans, but it also had been laid waste by the Black Death, so it was in a vulnerable state. On taking Constantinople, Mehmet II allowed 3 days of looting and the sack of the city, which was kind of like standard practice, although he put a limit of 3 days. Well, some of his soldiers went overboard. I mean, many churches were destroyed, children, women, raped, killed. It wasn't pleasant. And there were a number of Christians who were housed in Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, and they had closed the bronze doors and thought that they were safe, but the Ottomans were able to get in and began using their scimitars and slicing people, and it was quite a scene. And then after 3 or 4 days, Mehmet went into Hagia Sophia and was struck by the devastation that his soldiers had wrought and called it to a halt. But of course, Hagia Sophia became a mosque. Now, it led to questions about how should the Christians respond to the loss of Constantinople. It's a bit like, say, losing Rome. It's a big loss. Now, Pius II was one of the, he was the Pope at the time, and he put forward one idea that, do you not think that we should go back on crusade? He said, in the past, our Christian faith has been subject to pressure and conflict in regions that have been other, not necessarily Christian, as a majority, but this is right in our homeland. Should we not raise a crusade? He was defeated. It didn't happen. But there was a man called Nicholas of Cusa, who was a German theologian and monk, and he wrote a book just after the fall of Constantinople called On the Peace of Faith. On the Peace of Faith. And Peter Walker, who's just about to become the new General Secretary of the Synod, wrote his PhD thesis on Nicholas of Cusa. And it imagined a summit meeting in heaven of representatives of all nations and religions. The conference agrees that there can be a single faith but manifested in different rites. The dialogue presupposes greater accuracy of the Christian faith, but also gave respect to other religions. Well, it doesn't necessarily lead into edicts of tolerance and what have you, but it shows that in response to that past 2 centuries of crusades, there are people like Francis of Assisi and Nicholas of Cusa who were actually calling for something quite different. In the long view, what the Ottoman taking of Constantinople means is that Asia Minor is lost to the Christian faith. Now, you think of all of Paul's epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, Galatians, they're all from modern-day Turkey. They were Christian sites, but they disappear at this time. And so much so that there was an attempt at one stage to, with North Africa and Asia Minor gone, in one region where there had previously been 300 bishops, now they couldn't find more than one. And the Christian presence in Turkey today is minuscule. And it's a result of 1453. So it's a big watershed moment. I want to come to Martin Luther next. Are there any comments about crusades, the loss of Constantinople? Is anyone willing to get on their horse with me and try and get Hagia Sophia back?
I think the interesting thing about Hagia Sophia is that, for a number of years it was a museum.
Yes.
Before it then became a mosque.
Yeah.
Again, which
Yes.
kind of reflects those internal tensions.
That's under
within
Erdogan.
Turkey.
He's made it a mosque again.
It's
Yes.
changing again now.
And in fact, if you go into Hagia Sophia, you can see Christian mosaics, and then also you can see Muslim script as well, Islamic Arabic script. But he's made it back into a mosque for the meantime.
We haven't learned
I'm coming. Fun?
We haven't learned much.
No.
I mean, that part of the world is still as hostile within it
Yes.
now as it was 500 years ago.
Yes. Well, a lot of it has to do with this troubled history. Martin Luther, of course, we know him as the great Protestant reformer and distinguish him from the Roman Catholic faith. When it came to other religions, what was most well known about Martin Luther for many years was his anti-Semitism. Initially he had been quite tolerant towards Jews, but then in the late 1520s he wrote some tracts against the Jews, which unfortunately a certain gentleman in Nazi Germany picked up on in the 1930s. Adolf Hitler said he was simply continuing the work of Martin Luther. Well, so there was an anti-Semitic strain in Luther, but he also had to deal with Islam. And that has been a fairly unrecognised side of Luther. And so what was he concerned about? First of all, the Ottomans had gradually moved in the 1520s. They had moved into the Balkan states, as far as Hungary, and some of you may have been to Budapest, and you've seen the wonderful cathedral there. Budapest fell to the Muslims in 1526, and St. Matthias Cathedral became a mosque. And so at one level, Luther was able to see the gradual spread of Islam into Europe. It was heading his way. Again, in the 1540s, he would write in another, I'll leave that part to one side for a moment. And after having taken Budapest, they moved further and further west, and by 1529, they are at the gates of Vienna. And so you have this Ottoman incursion. Now, when Luther came to respond to Islam, he responded in two ways. There's an earlier period, and that is primarily a response to the incursion of the Ottomans and making their way as far as Vienna. And so what he's wanting to do is actually quite pastoral. He's wanting to say, what happens if your country becomes invaded and you find yourself now under the Muhammad Reich, under the rule of the Muslims? How do you hold on to your Christian faith? And so he was giving advice about how they might do that. But he was also involved in a fairly volatile campaign against the Catholic Church. And he wanted to depict, he might call his Catholic opponents a bit more like the infidel Saracens, like he used the Muslims as kind of identifying them as being against the will of God, as the Catholics were, and so that rather than go and have a further crusade, as some people were calling for, as the Ottomans made their way to Turkey, made their way to Vienna, and that was more of a Catholic position, Luther said no. He was against a crusade and believed that it was not incumbent upon Christians. It would be a humiliation of Christ if we went to war. And he then wanted to say this incursion of the Ottomans and the Muslim religion into parts of Europe, could that be regarded as part of God's chastising of us for falling away from our practice of the gospel? He also had in mind that in his time, he believed that the end of the world was relatively nigh. And as you can remember from apocalyptic texts in the Gospels, you will hear about war, there will be rumours of war and people against each other. And he interpreted this as a sign of the times preparing the way for the end. So that although the Muslims were coming, in the long run, the way of Christ would prevail. And that what people might need to endure in the meantime was this chastisement, but at the same time, they needed to know how to retain their Christian belief in the face of this threat. That was the earlier period. And the great Muslim leader of this time, who comes in number 2 in the lineup after Saladin, is Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the Sultan at the time, Suleiman the Magnificent. Wouldn't it be great to be called that? Suleiman, of course, is Solomon. And by the 1540s, Luther took a different tack because, of course, Vienna had withstood it. The Muslims hadn't taken Vienna and they had retreated somewhat. But he believed it was very important to learn as much as he could about the Quran, so he actually knew what Muslims believed. Because the legacy of the Crusade was that you had so many stereotypes and caricatures that weren't always accurate. And Luther knew for himself that there was something about the way in which some of the Muslim architecture could impress people, their prayer life could be impressive. So he was thinking, in order to help Christians, he needed to understand better what Muslims actually believed. Now, he couldn't go down to a bookshop and buy a Quran. So he petitioned the Council of Basel, which is on the Swiss-German border. He petitioned them to allow for a translation of the Quran so that he could study it. And so he took a look, he gave a more critical understanding of the Quran. He did it with a Christian lens. He thought they were terrible heretics. He thought they were a bit like the heretic Arius from the time of the Council of Nicaea. He was critical of them. But I think one of the legacies of Martin Luther for us is that he showed the need for a pastoral sensitivity towards those who find themselves in regions controlled by Islam, and that happens in a number of countries in the Middle East today. The second thing is, he was saying we really do need to understand what Muslims actually believe. Now, today, I suspect that any scholar would say he didn't quite understand exactly what Muslims believed, but he had a general idea. Which brings us to Australia. So a big leap. And in the meantime, we've seen the fall of the Ottoman Empire, of course. Any questions before we head towards Australia?
What's the Sharia law? Because that hasn't been mentioned. That's a state thing.
It's a form. I'll go back one stage. In Islam, I've mentioned the importance of the pillars of wisdom, those festivals, the Quran, the Hadith. Alongside that, they have a very strong sense of jurisprudence, a sense of law. And Sharia can fit into that. And it's based on legal precepts which are taken out of the Quran, but it's not applied everywhere. And despite Donald Trump saying that it was applied in London by the present mayor, it's not practiced in London at all. It is in parts of Afghanistan, and to our way of thinking, it's got a brutal edge to it. Yes, yeah.
Well, during the Crusades, were there many Jews living in Jerusalem and in the Middle East?
There were some. I mean, most Jews had been driven out of Israel, what we know as Israel-Palestine, in 70 AD by the Romans, and then there was a follow-up campaign in the 120s. So most Jews were living in diaspora, but there were still smaller Jewish communities in the area. And Saladin, when he retook Jerusalem, he welcomed the Jews back into Jerusalem after they had been driven out.
Were they Sephardic Jews? Or did they not?
I think there probably would be would be Ashkenazi, because at the Ashkenazi were east. The Sephardic Jews went to Spain.
So, Clive, why was Martin Luther against that? Was he anti-Semitic? Why did he have that idea when he said that?
Well, I think that there has been running through the Christian faith this idea that the Jews killed Jesus. I mean, you can look at John's Gospel. That came home to me very forcibly when I was a minister in Christchurch in New Zealand, when one of the members of our congregation, professor at the university, he was Christian, but he was from a Jewish background. And all of a sudden, coming up towards Easter and reading some of those John readings, you become very aware, well, there are people who have a Jewish background here. And if you're hearing that all the time, it can be very confronting. So I think that would have been it. But initially, the other side of it, of course, is that you've got the Pauline epistles, where Paul would actually say Jews and Christians will be together at the end. So I think you've got that tension. But I think it's also difficult to resist popular momentum once it raises its head. One of the things which we noticed last time when we were looking at the Black Death was there was a tremendous upsurge in anti-Semitism then. And I think Luther's life is not that much later than the Black Death. So I think there's probably a popular momentum there. But he certainly didn't intend to create a legacy for Hitler to exploit. That was just Hitler seizing the opportunity. But it shows you how careful you have to be with your words. Let me bring you to Australia to finish off with. According to the 2021 census, Islam is now the second largest religion in Australia. At the census, 3.2% of Australians are Muslim, and that, of course, varies from one area to another. In Auburn, for instance, it's much, much higher. Castle Hill, I said, was 5.1. The vast majority of Muslims in Australia are Sunni, not Shia. There are differences of ethnicity, culture, and language. It's not a monolithic community. It's multilingual and multicultural. Islam arrived in Australia before the Christian faith did. It has been in Australia since the 1500s. And it came with the Makassar traders from Indonesia, who were long-time visitors to Arnhem Land, and they were seeking to trade in trepang. I don't know what trepang is. It's some kind of sea marine creature which was regarded as a delicacy back in Makassar. Not liking seafoods, I haven't encountered trepang. And there was some intermarriage with Aboriginal people, and there is one Aboriginal tribe which created a dance for the dream time reflecting creation, where the creator is named as Walitha, which is an indigenous rendering of Allah. From the 1860s, there were Afghan cameleers, except most of them weren't Afghans. They came basically from Pakistan. Camels were first imported into Australia in the 1840s. And of course, the Afghan cameleers were brought to deal with those. And of course, we get the Ghan as a train now, don't we? There was, as I said, intermarriage with indigenous population. Later on, Malay Muslims were also brought into Western Australia and the Northern Territory. The first mosque was built in 1861 in a place called Murray in South Australia. The Great Mosque in Adelaide in 1888. The mosque in Broken Hill between 1887 and 1891. And the first record of Eid public prayers, the Muslim Christmas festival, was in Albert Park in Melbourne in 1881. The first Western conversions to Islam in this country happened in the 1930s when Western women married some Muslims. The first sign of conflict came in Broken Hill during the First World War. It's called the Battle of Broken Hill. 2 Afghans pledged allegiance to the Ottoman Empire and shot dead 4 Australians and wounded 7 others. The incident became known as the Battle of Broken Hill. It is now looked upon Australia's earliest terrorist attack. But you can see something of the ambiguity in what happens in times of war when you have your ethnic homeland on the other side. And I have often asked Muslim friends of mine, and Turkish friends in particular, how do you feel on Anzac Day? And some of them, some decades ago, used to say it was one of the most difficult days at school. It's eased a great deal from what it was. During the White Australia policy, migration was basically confined to the Albanian population. Albania is the one Muslim country in Western Europe, or Western Southern Europe. And so most Muslims in that period were from Albania. The increase in numbers and the wider background of peoples is due to the immigration policy changes from the 1970s on, and then to the reception of refugees. Every now and then, there are times of conflict, and they are often heightened by what happens overseas, like in the wake of 9/11, the First and Second Gulf Wars, the Bali bombings, the London Underground bombings, and those events which happen at a distance have a profound effect on what it's like to be Muslim in this country, because on the one hand, you will of course have some people who will come out in support of the Muslim country, but you will also find that there can be reactions against Muslims here in Australia at such times that becomes more intense. And of course we've had the kind of policing profile, those of Middle Eastern appearance. And of course that was associated with some Lebanese rapes and killings as well. So that all leads to a fairly complex kind of situation. It has also led that sometimes heightened opposition has happened during, we want to build a school in your neighbourhood, we want to build a prayer house, or we want to build a mosque. They have been touchstones for reaction. One of the most serious encounters, of course, was the Cronulla race riots back in 2005. Do you remember that? And you had, on the one hand, you had people in the Shire and the iconic beaches, and a lot of the literature at the time was talking about, on the basis of this, you would expect everyone in the Shire goes to church. It was regarding itself as kind of the Judeo-Christian heartland, whereas the people who were protesting and coming across to Cronulla often came from Lakemba and those kind of areas, so were Muslim. And it was aided and abetted by some of the radio shock jocks too, who were calling for deep opposition. I wrote an article in response to that. It had to do with what I called the alienated neighbour. Some background. Since about the year 2000, it was initially through Mary, who was invited to be part and parcel of an interfaith women's group. And there is a group here in Sydney called Affinity. It's an intercultural society. It's concerned for social cohesion. Its leadership and driving force has been Muslim. And they invited Mary to be part and parcel of this interfaith group that was running. And then all of a sudden, there was an upsurge in the call for Australian values, which was distancing things from other cultural perspectives. So Mary and I invited a large group of Muslims to come to our home at Christmas time, and we played backyard cricket in order to celebrate celebrate Australian values. And it was so funny seeing Turkish women wearing hijabs bowling the ball as fast as they could at the heads of their husbands. It was a great occasion, but it did mean that I ended up becoming a member of the advisory council for this Muslim social cohesion group. I also became involved in being asked to contribute a Christian section on what it was called the Report on Islamophobia in Australia. And there have been 3 major reports. And what I want to say is that at times of heightened difficulty, heightened conflict, the most vulnerable people in the Muslim world have not been people who have been terroristically inclined at all. It has been young women wearing hijabs outside schools picking up their children. They are subjected to some horrendous stuff. And they are caught between having to say to their 5 or 6-year-olds, it's okay, you're safe, but at the same time hearing some of the comments that are coming their way. Well, the Islamophobia report was able to highlight that there have been far-right Christian groups, and we know there are far-right groups in Australia today, and they kind of often present themselves, that they lay claim to having a Judeo-Christian heritage. And they use that then to justify opposition to Islam. Well, that is part and parcel of the background to why I wrote on the criminal race riots. I was struck by the fact that it's easy to have hate and not know the other, and to have caricature and stereotypes if you do not talk to your neighbour. And I could not get out of my mind the parable of the Good Samaritan, which talks about how you are called to serve the neighbour who feels at risk. And so I wrote an article on the alienated neighbour. Now, I know that Alan has read that article because he told me, because it's online. Thank you, Alan. You're about the only Christian who's ever read it in Australia. But I had so many Muslims read it, and they were so grateful for it, that you had a Christian presence on that. Where I'm going with this is, I also helped bring Islamic studies into the university. It happened on a coach when we were travelling to Nicaea. I always think a funny thing happened on the way to Nicaea. A Muslim leader asked me, do you think we can get Islamic studies in the university? So I said, shall we try? Well, they now have 200 or 300 students. They've produced a lot of PhDs. And the great thing is they've been able to provide an Islamic education in Australia so that their students don't have to go to Egypt or Iran or Saudi Arabia. They're ending up with a more Australian established understanding of Islam. And I initiated a program called Scriptural Reasoning. What that means is that you are actually trying to understand what the other side believes. Now, when I first proposed this to the Islamic scholars, they said to me, we're not ready yet. They were still having to deal with a whole range of issues. But after about a gap of 15 years, they said, we're right now. And what you do with scriptural reasoning is that you identify either a character that is in both the Bible and the Quran, or you identify a value like justice or compassion. And you then ask the Christians to talk about it in their own group, so they have wrestled with it. You ask the Muslims to talk about it in their own group, and you then ask them to report back. And so you actually hear Muslims talking about compassion, and for a number of Christians, that's the first time they've ever heard that. Sometimes they'll be talking about Mary, and we'll be saying, that's not how we see Mary, but we are actually talking with one another and learning. And then we will mix the groups up. And so you have this kind of scriptural reasoning. And the reasoning behind it was, I said to them, look, when there are points of conflict, you actually need people from another faith to be able to speak about what you really think and experience, and not just leave it to the world of stereotype and caricature. You need to build bridges. And so one of the plans behind the scriptural reasoning was so that if you end up in trouble, maybe we'll speak for you. Now, an example of that, I'll close with this, has to do with Cronulla. Auburn is home to the greatest number of refugees in Australia, and there are a lot of Muslims there. There are quite a number of Tongans as well. And as a number of Tongans said to me, we'd never met a Muslim before. And a number of Muslims said to me they didn't know Tongans existed. But they do when they live in Auburn. And a Islamic school was beside the Auburn church. The church hall was set on fire. This was at the time of the Cronulla Race riots. And because the feeling of the time was so heightened, the media came out to Auburn expecting that the church hall had been set on fire by the Muslims. What they found was Dean Drayton, who was at that time president, walking arm in arm down the street with the local Muslim leader. It wasn't reported because it was good news. It didn't fit the news media thing. And it so turned out that the church hall fire was due to some drug dealers of another culture, another faith. So, but it meant on that occasion, Dean was able to stand up in support of the other. And in a way, we've had a very troubled history with Islam, but it's not one-sided, it's both sides. The Crusades were our jihad. And the memories have been long-lasting, and the impacts and legacies have been great. But there are occasions when initiatives have been taken in order to better understand the other and find ways of being a bridge. I'll close by saying one other thing, is that, two other things. Cardinal Pell, during the Cronulla Race riots, took great exception. He said, I've been reading the Quran, but it's so violent in certain parts. That's the Medina part, and it is in certain parts. I ran a conference at the college. I ran a conference at the college about violence in scriptures, where we had to wrestle with the violence within our own scriptures. The second thing is that women who wear an hijab are often seen as under the tutelage, under the thumb of their husbands. The women who choose to wear a hijab are usually younger women. They're well educated, and they have chosen to do so themselves. They do not see it as a constraint at all. And one of the things which has struck me is that as you look at the demographic profile of the Christian faith and the churches today and Islam, Islam is younger than we are. And they give a lot of prominence to education, and the women are incredibly articulate, and I think more gifted than the blokes. So that brings to a close the session. Just to, I hope at least you just take away, Islam's been in Australia longer than the Christian faith. I mean, that's worth Trivial Pursuits, isn't it? Yeah. So that is the series of 4. I'll do another series next year, and I gave you already 3 of those that I will do, because I do think we live in a time where at times we are getting unhinged from our own history and stories, And I think it's important that we have some kind of grounding and rooting in that. So thank you for coming.